Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Active Assailant, Mitigating Risk. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law sans the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Jim will discuss definition of terms, brief incident history, common threads, mitigation measures, litigation risk, and litigation history. To give you a little background about our presenter, Jim Francis has extensive experience in the security profession, spans both government and industry. Mr. Francis started his security profession as a special agent with the United States Air Force Office of Special Investigations. He later served as a manager of security for Major Division of Lockheed Missiles and Space Co. Incorporated. He started consulting in 1990 and has provided consultation services worldwide. Attendees who require a passcode, the word for today is assailant. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you're applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget located at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Jim, the presentation is now turned over to you.
All right, thank you, Rochelle. For those of you who don't understand all that goes on in the background, Rochelle has been tremendous asset in pulling this together. We started chatting about a presentation way back in August, and then based on events of the day, determined that talking about active shooter, active assailant was probably a very timely discussion for any numbers of reasons. And I usually like to have kind of a direct interlink with the audience so I can better understand you folks. I'll give you a little bit more about me. I have generally been involved in doing consulting work for major projects or major clients. As an example, I provided assistance to the New York Yankees in developing all of their policies and procedures regarding security and emergency management for opening day when the new stadium first opened. As part of a response to 9/11, I led the largest private security task force conducting security assessments, particularly in New York City, looking at security measures in place and folks' ability to respond to an incident. In terms of my history as an expert, I've provided assistance on the cases that you see shown and have full consultative experience up to and including court testimony. One issue of interest that has come up most recently is use of force and the use of force continuum. It normally is great for me as well to get a little background on the audience, certainly to find out why some of you may be interested in participating today. There are those of you who are on the call who may have either a friend, a family member, a coworker who has actually been involved in one of these horrific situations, or maybe your firm is actively engaged at the moment in supporting a client on litigation regarding this issue, either from a defense perspective or plaintiff's perspective. It is also important that we recognize that we need to get a better awareness for all of us on what this issue is and how we can best protect ourselves, prevent it hopefully from happening, and if we're in the middle of it, respond appropriately. All of that really revolves around planning, training, preparation, and mitigation, and those are the things that we're going to talk about today. It's important for us to have some commonality of terms. And why do I call it active assailant? That is not my choice of terms. That is kind of the new term now because of the unfortunate circumstances, and I have a case that you'll see in a moment, where a gun was not the implement of danger. And so we now have to look at it from multiple threat perspectives, and that's why we have the term active assailant versus active shooter, although you'll see a predominance of the term active shooter being used. Foreseeability is probably one thing that all of you have to deal with on a daily basis, as I do. And that is an issue for all of us because it varies with jurisdiction. And how does that play into proximate cause? And what damages or injuries may occur related to the foreseeability and the person's reasonable actions to anticipate that that may occur. We're also going to chat and introduce the term terrorism because a lot of shooting incidents are terrorist incidents and fall into that category, which changes the perspective because terrorism is designed primarily as the use of intentionally indiscriminate violence as a means to create terror among masses of people, and this is the important part, to achieve a financial, political, religious, or ideological aim. We're also going to introduce 6 Ps, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but we'll later on relate to that term in slightly different way. So the incident that I talked about where now we are prompted to use the term active assailant rather than active shooter revolves around this horrific incident that occurred in Oklahoma where a woman in her workplace was killed by a coworker and was actually beheaded in that horrible, horrible incident. And so now we have to look at the varied kinds of threats that may exist and how an assailant may use the various weapons available to him or her, and there are hers that have been involved in active assailant situations. But this just illustrates that we have to be ready for any kind of situation where a person may come into the workplace, the school, the offices, wherever it may be, and wreak havoc amongst the workforce, and then think about the resulting trauma of this family, this workforce, this company, after having such a horrific event occur. A little brief history of the event, and this chart illustrates the study of the FBI of active incidents from 2000 to 2013. And you'll see that that's a fairly significant bit of historical information. However, they've updated this report, and they issued the report covering the periods of 2016 and 2017. And you'll see that 160, only is a bad way of relating to it, 160 incidents occurred between 2000 and 2013, whereas in the years 2016 to 2017, 50 incidents occurred just in that 2-year time period. And that was up from 40 in 2014 and 2015. In terms of casualties in the years 2016 to 2017, there were 943. And think of that in terms of the 2-year period as it relates to the 13-year period that is covered in this chart. In terms of the resulting injuries, there were 221 folks who were unfortunately deceased, and 722 who were wounded during that same time period, which again is up from the statistics in 2014 and 2015. In that period, 2016 through 2017, there were 50 shooters, In this time period, they were all male, and 26 were apprehended and 24 were deceased, either by their own hand or by responding officers. This chart kind of illustrates the climbing scale of the frequency of incidents in the United States across the period of 2000 to 2017. In 2017, it includes, unfortunately, that horrible shooting in Las Vegas where 49 people were killed and 53 were wounded in that MGM shooting for that festival that was being conducted on the grounds nearby. We're going to be focusing a bit today on the timeline. And I use this chart often when I'm trying to teach folks what's the difference between incident response and crisis management. An incident is something that you can deal with, and really there's no significant impact of that incident. In this case, I use as an example that an intruder alarm is activated at a facility, and a lockdown is initiated because the threat is now inside of the facility. A search is conducted, and no intruder is found, and all clear is given, and everyone returns to normal activities, as opposed to the situation where the weapon is discharged, and now we are in a crisis mode, and it escalates from that incident, and we start having all of these horrible impacts, and we're getting emergency responses. Why is this timeline important? It's important for us to understand how quickly these incidents occur and are over. The Sandy Hook timeline, if you'll look at the bottom of this particular slide, in the bottom right-hand corner, it says the shooting ends after only 3 minutes. And that's why prior preparation and planning is so critical. For those initial periods, you're on your own. You're going to be leading whatever response efforts are conducted, because emergency responders cannot be present and respond to your facility that fast unless they are present at the time of the occurrence. Can it happen to you? I did a quick Google search today because I was curious to find out, were there situations that involved law firms? And unfortunately, I found a half dozen or so within a very short period of time. In June of this year, 2 paralegals were shot to death at a law firm in Arizona, where this distressed person, the shooter, was taking out his vengeance on folks that he thought had wronged him in I think it was a divorce proceeding. In California, a law firm shooting ended with 2 dead when a person walked into the law firm where he worked and shot 2 of his colleagues before turning the gun on himself. In a situation this year, a prominent divorce attorney was shot and killed at his law office by the husband of a client he was representing. And it goes on. In one particular case, an alleged gang member in Raleigh was involved in a shooting, a drive-by shooting that resulted in the death of one of the law firm members. And these kinds of incidents are real, and they can happen anywhere at any time. And so preparation is key. I'm going to be asking you to be thinking about this, not only for clients you may represent, either those who may have been unfortunately involved in such a situation, or folks who are trying to be better prepared to prevent such a situation. I hope that the things we talk about today and some of the guidance provided will help you better deal with these situations, regardless of how they may arise. So there are certain objectives that any of this planning or preparation really needs to have in the forefront as you're starting to think about how do I potentially put things together that will help either prevent an incident from occurring or better respond if unfortunately we do have something we've got to deal with. And the most important thing to consider in this process is certainly life safety of all the different kinds of folks who may be in the facility. Prior coordination with emergency responders so that they know your facility and know where and how to get to the places that they need to go in order to thwart an incident that may be in progress. You obviously want to be able to preserve your facilities and your offices and your campus if that's the case. But you also, as part of planning, need to plan for all modes of operation. I often talk to schools about, in their planning for an active shooter situation, do they look at their off-hours activities, such as their sporting events or their theatrical events or their choir concerts, so that they can be prepared if unfortunately the incident happens outside of school hours, where that seems to be their primary focus. You also want to make sure, because your image and reputation can be seriously damaged and destroyed if you have failed to properly plan and coordinate. And obviously, after an incident that you may have suffered through, you want to get things back to normal as fast as you can. And that may include the need for trauma counseling for the staff members who may have been involved or heard of the situation. The big thing that we all have to deal with as we're looking to represent a particular client, either in defense or in a plaintiff perspective, was foreseeability. I'm sure all of you dealing with these kinds of things recognize that foreseeability is something that varies dramatically by jurisdiction. I happen to be residing in Texas, and those of us from Texas are very familiar with a Texas Supreme Court ruling on foreseeability in the Timberwalk versus Kane matter, where it kind of defines that a premises owner is not liable for the criminal acts of a third party unless certain things play in, and those factors include incidents that are historically within close proximity to the facility in question, the recency of those incidents, the frequency of such incidents, the similarity, and I've seen that play out, that it must be an exact match to the kind of incident that took place. And lastly, was there some publicity? So I'm sure all of you have some history with dealing with foreseeability and trying to better understand how it plays out in your jurisdictional court. There are some common threads to all of the active shooter situations that have been examined. Probably the most one is what we talked about a little bit ago when we were talking about Sandy Hook. They have a very, very compressed timeline. And as the chart says, they are historically less than 5 minutes in duration. Well, how does this respond to what the average police response time is to such an incident? Well, the average police response time is 3 to 10 minutes unless they're already on the scene. And so you can see that at least for those first few minutes of this horrific event, the folks who were there on scene under assault are the ones who have to react and respond to it. Next, we've all heard so many times, I could have told you that he was going to do something like this, or I saw these indicators, but then nothing happened with them. And if you look at the observable steps of someone on a pathway to violence, the first one is they have what's called the grievance stage, where they exhibit hostile or dark speech, or in their drawings or writing or other expressions, they express this real grievance to either the organization, the person, whatever it may be. And then they have violent ideation, which is I'm thinking about how I can get even. And perhaps I do this in declarative writing, where I may even write a manifesto about my grievance against this. And certainly we saw in the Unabomber that manifesto is something that actually led to his being caught. Then they conduct and do research and planning for how they're going to do the event. They will start then moving into pre-attack preparation. Why these stages are important is because at each of these points, we have an intervention possibility, where if we become aware of this kind of a situation and this kind of an escalation path, we can intervene. And then lastly is the actual probing and looking to see how best to break in, and then the incident occurs. Some of the other common threads, and one in particular, is that there is inconsistent police response. We saw certainly in the Broward school shooting that the officer stayed outside in what would have been a typical hostage response as opposed to going in to neutralize the shooter. Let's talk about him a little bit. Nicholas Jacob Cruz, born September 24th, 1998. He had continuous reported behavioral issues. He was in classes for folks with emotional or learning disabilities. He had made threats against other students. School administration had circulated warnings about him. Psychiatrists recommended his involuntary commitment. Broward County Sheriff reports that they had like 23 different incidents. The FBI was advised that he was a potential danger. This is clearly a situation where he was exhibiting all these signs and was designated a threat, but folks did not intervene properly in order to deal with the situation. And now I believe we have a little time for questions and answers.
Thanks, Jim. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is Assailant, and any questions that you have for Jim. Our first question, what do you think is the biggest failure in the cases of active assailant that you've reviewed?
I think the biggest failure is in what we just talked about, that recognizing that a person was exhibiting a pattern or signs of threat and that no appropriate action was done to really thwart that before it became a horrific event.
Next question. Is using the Run, Hide, Fight video produced by the DHS sufficient to train staff?
We'll get into that in a little bit, Rochelle, but the answer there is, while that is a good thing for each one of us to look at, and for those of you not familiar with it, Department of Homeland Security put out and produced a video called Run, Hide, Fight, where it walks through the potential stages of an active shooter situation and how you as an individual can and should respond to it to better protect yourself. The run phase obviously is if you can escape, do so. If you can't escape, hide, or barricade yourself in a position where you can be inaccessible to the shooter, and if you are right there be prepared to fight with all you've got to save your life if necessary and the lives of others.
Next question. Should schools have armed guards?
That, as we certainly saw in the Broward situation, and even we saw in Columbine, they did have armed guards on the premises. And so the armed guards are there to serve as a theoretical deterrent, but unfortunately in both cases, they were not, either in one case they were not near the situation and therefore couldn't respond, and in the case of Broward, the officer who was present on duty chose not to respond appropriately. So armed guards can serve as a deterrent, but they should not be seen as the panacea where they will actually be able to totally prevent an occurrence.
And last question for this section. What should you do if someone is exhibiting behavior that is escalating and you think it may lead to a dangerous situation?
Well, I think if you are as an individual observing that kind of behavior, you need to report it. But there needs to be a mechanism developed for such reporting. So as I consult with my clients, whether it's a school or a business, I advise them that they need to have some confidential reporting capability where folks can feel comfortable reporting these observations of potentially threatening indicators so that intervention can be accomplished.
Thanks, Jim. You can continue with the presentation.
All right. Thanks, Rochelle. So what are some mitigation measures that you can do? Well, we are, because of the situation being so predominant in our culture, if you will, there are now some standards and guidelines and other resources available to us to help better plan and prepare. NFPA recently released their NFPA 3000 standard for active shooter and hostile event response. They call it their ASHER program. This program is primarily a community or a municipality approach to dealing with these so that all of the municipal forces and facilities available can better understand how to coordinate a response to this kind of a situation. However, part of it also requires that if a community adopts this standard, that businesses within the community have to develop their own companion plans and present those plans so that they can be incorporated in the body of the whole ASHER program. Other things available to folks are the Department of Homeland Security Emergency Action Plan Guide for how to develop a plan for active shooter preparedness. We talked about the availability of the Run, Hide, Fight video to go with that. They also provide a DHS active shooter how to respond guideline. FEMA has a guideline, and certainly an organization that I'm a part of, American Society for Industrial Security, or as it's known now as is International, has a guideline on workplace violence prevention and intervention. One thing I'm often asked, and in fact in one deposition I got into, I'd say almost a debate with the opposing counsel about the difference between codes, standards, and guidelines. And something really that you have to recognize is that codes are regulatory. And so you don't have a choice as being in a certain municipality, country, whatever it may be, because there are national and local codes, and those are regulatory and enforceable within that jurisdiction. Standards, guidelines, and other such kinds of resources are generally either contributory toward the code so that you understand how to implement the code, or they are totally voluntary. So it's important to understand that as you're looking to potentially utilize these in your planning or in how you're looking at this related to a case you may be working on. Standards and guidelines are voluntary and codes are regulatory. I'm sure a number of you who are on the call today have children in school. And one of the things that I have done with my own grandchildren is to try to take a look at how well the schools where they go are prepared to deal with a horrific situation. In 2006, as you'll see on this slide, a gunman in September of that year entered Platte Canyon High School in Colorado and had held 7 girls hostage and then ultimately killed this 16-year-old girl, Emily Keyes. During the time she was held hostage, she sent text messages to her parents, reminding them that she loved them. Since that, her parents have founded a group called ILoveYouGuys.org. I suggest that if you want to help your schools and your children who may be going to those schools, introduce this organization to your schools. They offer free to schools planning guidelines on how to deal with active shooter training, preparedness, and posters and all of the things that would be helpful in having a school be better ready and able to deal with such a horrific situation or prevent it in the first place. I told you we were going to talk about the 6 Ps. Well, I've changed the 6 Ps a little bit for the purposes of this presentation to prepare, prevent, plan, publish, practice, polish, and have it a continual loop where it's constantly updating itself. So what does prepare mean? Prepare means really conducting an assessment of the current conditions so that you know, what do I really have in place? What security systems and devices do I really have? Generally in my business we call that a threat, vulnerability, and risk assessment. To really understand what are the kinds of threats might I be confronted with, of which active assailant may be one, but there are numerous others, and let me relate it to a law firm. In this threat and vulnerability and risk assessment, you would look at how is my office laid out? Can folks immediately come into the front door and be into the total office space and have access to all of our conference rooms and attorney offices? Where is mail delivered and sorted? And if, God forbid, we had a situation where there was a suspicious package or parcel that came into that desk or sorting area, how would we deal with it? Then in the prevention, you're going to implement the modifications and upgrades and other items that you've discovered in that threat and vulnerability assessment. One of the things that I think is important for you to consider, particularly as attorneys, is how well are your folks trained in verbal interdiction skills. An excellent story comes out of Atlanta, where in, I guess it was 2013, this person was working in her office of administration in the Ronald McNair Discovery Learning Academy in Decatur, Georgia, when a 20-year-old gunman stormed in with an AK-47 assault rifle and 500 rounds of ammunition. She, using her verbal skills and her own strength of personality, talked him out of his weapon, talked him out of harming anyone, and when the police came, he surrendered without incident. Of particular note, this woman's name was Tough. And if anybody was ever tough in the line of fire, it was this lady. And she was certainly prepared for a purpose, which she has authored a book by that name. And so any of you who might be interested in verbal interdiction skills can really work, and they can really save lives. So, what is one of the major things that all organizations should do? Well, as we saw from the Nicholas Cruz situation, there were numerous indicators of him being a potential threat. So I advise all of my clients to develop a threat assessment team, where that team will constantly look at the things in the facility, understanding the threats to that facility, that school, that business, whatever it may be, and implement measures that will constantly morph and modify to help prevent a potentially violent situation. And one of the things that this threat assessment team becomes is the repository for all of this information related to threatening individuals, written or verbal or media threats that may be directed at that particular organization, and then they determine how best to respond to those kinds of things. After certain incidents, there were some studies pulled together, and in particular, the Virginia Tech situation led to this study of how to best deal with it, and a published guideline of implementing behavioral threat assessment on campus is an excellent document to lead folks through pulling together a threat assessment team and program. American Psychological Association has looked at it. The National Behavioral Intervention Team Association has looked at this. And I encourage any of you who are interested in this particular topic or want to assist your firm or your clients in developing such a threat assessment team and threat management program, these are great guidelines for you to do so. So I've actually seen some things to kind of report on to you. One of my biggest problems as I'm out reviewing programs in a lot of different facilities, in this case particularly schools, is a confusion between terms. And so definition of terms was important to us in the beginning, and it's very important when it relates to these two terms of lockout and lockdown. If you are, again, going to take a look at what your school, that's where you send your children every day, and how well prepared they may be for an event, this is an important conversation to have with them. And that is, do they really understand the difference between these two terms? Simplistically, the difference is this. Lockout means the threat is outside of the building, and I'm going to lock the building so that the threat cannot come inside. Lockdown means the threat is within the building, and I have to be taking shelter and locking down, compartmentalizing to prevent the movement of that assailant. And that's an extraordinarily different reaction response, and so it's important that schools and communities, because I've heard police agencies call and say, there was a bank robbery 2 blocks away from your school, you need to put the school in lockdown, without clearly understanding the impact that a lockdown has on the students, the teachers, and the operations of that school. It is a traumatic situation to have the kids believe that there is a threat in their school and that they all have to sit in the corner of the classroom in the dark with the shades drawn away from the door, which is now barricaded so that the assailant cannot get in. Talk about being scared and having your anxiety go up. That's why it's so important to to understand the difference between those two terms. I've also seen situations where folks have been inadequately trained, where I was at one particular school and they were wanting to show me how well they had pulled together this lockdown drill, and they wanted to illustrate to me how well prepared they were. And they called the lockdown drill, and kids who were out and safe out of the building at recess were brought back in and locked in their classrooms rather than escaping to some other safe area away from the school. I was recently conducting a threat and vulnerability and risk assessment at a chain of hospitals, and without failure, the nurses on the floor who were responsible for the protection of patients during an incident had no knowledge of what they were really supposed to do if, in fact, that active shooter code was called over the PA system. And so they just would merely respond to protect themselves if they could, but had no real knowledge of what to do. We certainly saw in the Sandy Hook situation where the school principal and the school counselor ran towards the incident, which was certainly a natural response on their part, but it was an unfortunate response because they both were killed in that response. So one of the things we have to think about is that it's our responsibility to protect the majority and move them away from the incident as opposed to respond to the incident if we really can't do anything to thwart it. I've also been in situations where I've had to review their electronic security systems and found duress buttons not functioning properly or reporting to the wrong location. Again, in one hospital I looked at, the duress buttons reported right back to the originating spot of the duress. So you would notify yourself that you were under duress. In one particular high-rise office environment, the office of the senior executive, if one of the executive assistants pushed the duress button on his or her desk, it locked off the executive suite from the potential responders and sent off a loud 110 decibel tone in that executive suite, which would just further agitate the assailant who might have been present and cause potentially further harm. Seeing incomplete perimeter protection is almost the norm for every facility I go to, where they may have good controls of the front door but have no controls of the back door. A thing for us all to look at and be aware of is that there can sometimes be a code conflict. Fire codes can often prevent the barricading of doors into a classroom because it would be in violation of the fire code that requires a simple exiting on fire alarm. And we already have seen far too many incidents where these assailants have actually triggered the fire alarm system to start vacating the children or others so that they were now moving out of their safe areas and into areas where they could be targeted much more easily. So litigation risks include failure to properly identify the threat, failure to properly plan, failure to train all personnel, and we'll talk about that one in particular in a little bit, failure to test and prove out your system to make sure it is in fact working appropriately, negligent security systems in place that really didn't prevent the intrusion by the assailant in the first place, or inadequate response, which is another one we'll talk about regarding how certain law enforcement agencies responded to the situation. So how about litigation history? Well, I did my own little scan to find out what was going on in this legal world and where things stand regarding some of the more prominent lawsuits that are out there today. In one case, certainly the Cinemark situation where the Denver, Aurora, Colorado shooter went into the theater and shot any number of folks, the jury found that Cinemark was not liable because they had no foreseeability to that kind of event. In Virginia Tech, the award to certain parents was reversed based on, again, the lack of foreseeability. A peculiar one to me is the MGM Grand situation where they're claiming limited liability based on the Safety Act. We'll talk about that one a little bit more. In Sandy Hook, there are multiple suits. Suits against the school district itself, and recent reports, the family of two sued the school district, and the Newtown School District rejected very recently an $11 million settlement for the claims. And they were claiming that in this case, the school failed to train the substitute teacher on how to properly lock the classroom door, which led to the death of the two children. They also have suits against the gun manufacturers and distributors. And then this most curious one, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the suit against Alex Jones. Pulse nightclub, there were suits against the nightclub owners, the police responders, and social media. And in the case of a company called Accent Signage in Minneapolis, where there was a shooting from a prior employer, there was a claim that they should have known of the threat. So let's chat a little bit about the MGM case. MGM claimed that they have limited liability based on the Safety Act. Well, the Safety Act was particularly geared towards preventing or limiting the exposure of folks who are trying to put in place plans, programs, systems that will help thwart a terrorist attack. So that in the event of a terrorist attack, even if the terrorist succeeded in spite of these measures, they wanted to limit the liability of those who had developed or implemented them. In my personal opinion, the Safety Act is not relevant in the MGM defense. It was not defined as an act of terrorism, and to my knowledge, MGM is not a holder of a Safety Act certification. It was one of their security providers who was certified. This was quite curious. Alex Jones, who is quite a media personality of, I would say, ill repute, because he's a conspiracy theorist, he claimed that Sandy Hook was really nothing but a conspiracy story that really had no basis in fact. And so the families sued him to get him to stop his essentially crazy talk about the fact that the shootings at Sandy Hook had never really happened. This one is quite curious, and it's because the victims' families claim that the police did not respond properly to the event because they demonstrated a deliberate indifference to the people who were in the facility, probably by expectation that Pulse nightclub was an admitted gay nightclub, and their claims are that the police had an inherent prejudice against folks who were part of the LGBTQ community and therefore did not respond accordingly. So, kind of in summary, active assailant incidents are an unfortunate reality. The history of prior incidents can, in fact, demonstrate foreseeability. All of us, in terms of how we might either plan or examine plans of others, must recognize that the incident timeline is short and prior prevention and response planning is essential. The training and reporting of potential indicators, as we certainly saw with the Nicholas Cruz situation, if acted on appropriately, can reduce the risk. That was clearly an example of where everything went wrong in terms of how the folks reacted to Nicholas Cruz. To have that many incidents where he's recognized by the schools as a threat, to be removed from the school programs, to be transferred from school to school and never really have the problem resolved, to have the police have knowledge of him as a threat, to have the FBI have knowledge of him as a threat, and then to have him still be capable of conducting such a horrific act is hard to imagine. The code guidelines and other documents that are available do establish some level of standards for us to help our clients prepared or better help them defend themselves if, in fact, they've implemented those things, or on the converse, if they haven't, to be able to use those as means and methods to establish their levels of negligence. And lastly, as all of us know, litigation against any government entity, even a school district, is a very limited proposition and not very prone to success. So with that, I will turn it back for questions and answers.
Thank you, Jim. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is Assailant, and any questions that you have for Jim. Our first question, in the Las Vegas case, what should the Mandalay Bay Hotel have done differently to prevent the incident?
That's a very tough question. I think one of the things that they should have recognized was some very suspicious and unusual behavior on the part of the assailant. He prohibited having the housekeeping folks go into the facility. He had carted in a very unusual amount of materials. I mean, think about somebody staying in a hotel. They normally would not be bringing in such large quantities of materials. The fact that he had, because he was keeping the housekeeping out, I think that there are now procedures in the majority of hotels that they require their staff to do periodic checks of the rooms just to make sure that even if the person has refused housekeeping, that they're not doing something unusual in the room. If those things had been, at least by situational awareness, somebody had been looking for those kinds of indicators, he certainly exhibited unusual behavior. And if they would have done kind of building health checks to go in and make sure that all was well in the room where he had barricaded himself, they would have hopefully been able to prevent that kind of occurrence.
Next question. This is a follow-up from the first section with the bad behavior. They just wanted to see, to whom should these reports of bad behavior be made?
That, as I said, that should go to the threat assessment team. So it's important for an organization to define the threat assessment team, identify the members and alternate members, and have an easy reporting mechanism to get those kinds of observations to that team so that they can hopefully take intervention action.
Next question. Our synagogue has an armed guard outside near the entrance. Do you think an armed guard should be in the sanctuary during services?
I did reviews of a number of the synagogues in and around Manhattan. And normally they have an armed guard on the exterior to observe who's coming in, and then an armed guard on the interior to back up that person, because if an assailant is coming, the first person they may take out is that armed security officer standing prominently out in front of the facility.
Next question. In today's risky society, where some angry, diabolical individual might be hell-bent on taking human life, how does the average citizen go about taking any sort of reasonable precautions to stay safe?
Okay, I'm sorry, Rochelle. I need you to repeat that because I didn't quite get it. You broke up a little bit.
In today's risky society, where some angry, diabolical individual might be hell-bent on taking human life, how does the average citizen go about taking any sort of reasonable precautions to stay safe?
First thing I would suggest is take a look at that video, Run, Hide, Fight. I think that's something that each one of us should look at because it does answer a lot of those questions. The first thing that you need to be prepared, though, is that if you are at that last stage where you have no other option but to fight, you must be prepared to do so. One of the things, for those of you who either have seen the video or do watch the video, when you do hide, be quiet. Turn off your cell phones. Make sure that you're not going to create noise that is going to draw that assailant to you. There is within the body of that little video, a woman just really can't kind of control herself, so she's making a lot of noise. And ultimately, the assailant comes into that room. You've got to make sure that if you're in that hide mode, you are doing it with the full intent that you don't want anybody to know you are there. So prepare yourself, maintain situational awareness. When you go into a place you're not familiar with, make sure you know where the exits are and how you will get out if you are in an emergency situation. Try not to put yourself in situations where you are creating vulnerability for yourself. If park in better lighted areas of a facility, make sure you approach every situation with awareness and don't let yourself be so focused on your cell phone or your earbuds that you're not paying attention to what's going on around you. I think those things will better prepare you for your own safety against these risky individuals.
Our last question. So Run, Hide, Fight is for individuals only, not part of a school's or administration's preparation?
Run, Hide, Fight is focused on what you as an individual should do in the event that you are put into an active shooter situation. That's why, from a school perspective, I really encourage all of my school clients to take a look at that iloveyoguys.org. It runs through developing a total program as it relates to developing an active shooter plan and how to conduct the training associated with it, because in a school environment, you are not individual. You're there to try to help better protect the staff and the kids and any visitors that may be in the school. And so Run, Hide, Fight being more individually centric, you need to have a program that recognizes that you as school officials, administrators, or teachers, or staff members, or facility maintenance personnel, you all need to be involved in that program and better protect the kids and others.
Thank you, Jim, for the presentation. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 60 minutes of this presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program, and all certificates will be emailed to you in 24 to 48 hours. In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts for more than 60 years, TASA also offers free interactive webinars, expert written articles, research reports on expert witnesses, such as the Challenge History Report 2.0 and Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Jim Francis for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Jim, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case you are currently working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. Again, thank you all for attending. This concludes our program for today.